Hey, this is John. Thanks for joining me for part 5 of this build of Bandai's HGUC RX-78-2 Gundam. In this episode, we are going to look at building and painting the weapons. The kit comes with two larger weapons. You've got this bazooka and this rifle. Both are just a few parts, assemble easily, so I'm not going to cover that. Because it's just like the assembly covered in previous episodes of this series. But they have a few moving parts. The scope on this one moves like that. The handle moves, so you'll want to make sure you pay attention to that. This one doesn't have any moving parts other than this handle right here. So keep that in mind in the next few steps. But when you assemble them, you'll notice that there's some seam lines along the top and the bottom. Now, if those don't bother you at all, you can skip the rest of this video, at least to the part where we paint it. But I like to deal with those to get rid of them, to make sure that it gives a nice smooth look, because when it's painted, it will definitely show up. And on a weapon like this, I don't know that this is the best place to convert that to a panel line. So I like to deal with the seams so that they are not seen. Once they're assembled, I start by simply taking some Tamiya extra thin cement now and gluing them together. Now, you don't have to use Tamiya extra thin cement, of course, but I do recommend using a welding cement, not just the regular tube glue cement, because these welding cements, when you put some in and give it a squeeze, it's going to extrude a little bit of the plastic, and that'll give you something to sand down. But the application is real simple. It's just like that I showed in the episode, I think it was part 2, on filling the seams. All you'll do is go in and apply that along the joins. And I'm fairly liberal with the application, because since I'm going to be using this to get rid of seams, I want a decent amount of it in there. You don't want it flooding the surface, but don't be afraid to use a little bit of it. And then once you've glued all the seams, you simply just squeeze it together like that. It will extrude just a little bit of plastic, and then you'll let that dry. I recommend letting it dry for at least 24 hours, and then we'll be able to address getting rid of those seams with either a hobby knife or sanding stick or something like that. One thing to note, when you're gluing the lower portions near where these parts move, be very careful in the application that you don't get it down in that joint. And one way to make sure that it stays movable is, after you glue it, move it around some, and every few minutes, for maybe the first 15 minutes while the glue is starting to set, just quickly move those parts, just a little bit like that. And that'll make sure that they're not getting locked up. If after a few times you see that there's no stickiness to them at all, then you've managed to avoid them and they're good to go. One quick note, there is a yellow scope part that goes in the front of this scope here, and I've left that off for now so that it can be painted with the other parts, which will be covered in a different episode. So take note of that. Okay, with the parts glued together, I would just go in and deal with them like I demonstrated in part 2 of this series on dealing with seams. I would just go in and take my hobby knife and scrape along it, get the bead, the glue bead down a little bit, and then sand it. Now, what I want to show is a little more advanced technique for dealing with these, because the weapons seem to have a little more egregious seam lines in them, and I get impatient and I don't want to keep sanding and sanding to try and get rid of those. So I take a further step that is certainly optional, but I want to show it to you because it's a very handy thing to have on any build. One of my favorite modeling products is Mr. Surfacer 500 from Mr. Hobby. It's the same people who make the Mr. Color line of paints. They make other grades of this, Mr. Surfacer 1000, Mr. Surfacer 1200. They've got others. The lower the number, the thicker it is. I like to use the 500 version because it's easy to thin, but if you get the thinner versions, it's not so easy to thicken them up. So I use this thicker version. What this basically is a paint on, you can brush paint it for bigger gap sealing. You can thin it and airbrush it for priming and micro surface filling. It's got a lot of uses. It's not designed for large gaps, but when we're dealing with seams like this along the top, where there's just a hint of it, and we would have to sand and sand and sand to get rid of it, this stuff is perfect. There are alternatives. You can use other fillers. You can use CA glue. You can use, people call it sprue goo, where you take some plastic and put it into a bonding cement, or not bonding, but like the Tamiya extra thin. You can put it in there and spread it on there. All those methods work fine. I've been using this since about 2006 on hundreds of models, and I love this stuff. So it's a handy tool to have in any modeler's workbench. Application for this purpose is very simple. First, I went in and gave it a good stir with my Badger stir tool. It's just an electric stirrer. This stuff is too thick to shake up the bottle, and it'll make a gloopy mess if you do. You can hand stir it, but I recommend having one of these because this has so many uses for every paint you have. So if you can, grab one. But all I do is I get an old brush. Make sure don't use one of your better brushes. Don't use a natural brush. This stuff is great for synthetic brushes. And all I do is I get a little on, and I just paint it along. Now you'll notice I'm not trying to go for the too thin coats. I'm not trying to get it a thin application on there. I'm deliberately letting it be very thick and heavy along there. Because what I want to do is I not only want to fill in that seam, I want to build up a little bit around it so that when I sand it, I have some material there to take to retain the shape. Now what I'll do, this stuff dries fairly fast to allow for a second coat. I'll let that dry maybe half an hour, and I'll come back and I'll see if I'm still seeing a little bit of the crack. Now you may see a little bit even though it's built up. As long as it's above the surface of where you're applying it, you're good to go. You may have to do 2 applications, but you'll get that on there, and of course you'll do the bottom also. You'll get that on there. Set this aside to dry. I recommend at least 3 days. You can let it dry overnight, but it has a tendency to shrink just a little bit. Just about any filler is going to shrink some. Even ones that I've read that the manufacturer says it's guaranteed not to shrink. I haven't found one yet that doesn't have some shrinkage. So another great thing about adding in this extra material is when it does shrink up, you've still got enough sticking up above the seam that you'll have something to sand. But I'm going to let this dry for several days and show you where I go next with it. Okay, I've let these dry. In real time, this was actually a few more than just a couple of days. But it's plenty dry. So now I can begin sanding this down and be assured that those seam lines are going to disappear. Now for the sanding, I'm going to do just like I demonstrated in part 2, the video dealing with seams, and I'm going to get my sanding stick. This is a 240 grit, and I'm going to wet it, and I'm just going to start sanding that down. This stuff sands, the Mr. Surfacer sands really well. It feathers nicely. Once it's allowed to dry and any shrinkage has taken place, it's gonna be rock solid. It's not gonna cause you any problems in terms of, you know, pulling loose or anything like that. But you'll see that with just a little bit of light sanding, I'm already getting it down to a nice smooth surface. And once it's painted, those seams should be completely gone. After a bit of sanding, the weapons are ready for painting. You'll notice there's a little left. Traces of that are fine. The sanding sticks will take it down, sanding it will take it down to the surface, and any imperfections and scratches and gaps that are left, that's what the Mr. Surfacer will do. It'll fill that in. You'll notice that it fills in like where there was a seam there. So, and you can take it down as far as you want. This is, once I put paint over this, I know this will be good. So these are ready to go. Now, when you wet sand the Mr. Surfacer, you'll get kind of a paste, a sludge left over from the sanding. And the way I clean that up is I just get an old toothbrush, dip it in some water, and just scrub it away, because you want to get that sludge off, because if you paint over the sludge and then later on you're doing some weathering or some dry brushing and you knock that sludge off, it will act as a mask, and the paint won't get through it. So clean them up real good after you're finished with the Mr. Surfacer. The next step will be painting, and I'm going to do these in two different styles just to show some different techniques and some different looks. This one I'm going to do a little more of a Canon style, not Canon with two ends, but Canon with one end, because this isn't a Canon, it's a bazooka. Anyway, I'll paint the body of the bazooka and the handle, the other parts, a dark gray, and then this ammo drum and this part here I'll do white. And that's, if you've seen the master grade versions of this, they have multicolored parts, and it gives it a nice look. So I'm going to do that one this way and do more of a traditional look. And then this one I'm going to paint the frame gray color, and then I'm going to show you how to make kind of an oily steel, maybe a more realistic looking weapon for the beam rifle. But I'll get the paint on there and pick up where we left off with that. All right, I painted portions of the bazooka white. I used Mr. Color Gundam color, MS white. It's a fabulous, fabulous white for sci-fi subjects. It's got just a touch of gray to it, so you can still highlight it with white, pure white, but it looks like white with other colors. So it's a very, very nice color. Now, to make it easy on myself, I'm going to mask just this whole back end off, because there's parts of it that are going to need to be gray, but it'll be easier to just mask the whole thing off and then mask this part off. And what I'll do is I'll come back later with some Vallejo Mecha Color Phantom Gray, which is pretty much a dead-on match for the gray color that I'm going to use here from Mr. Color. So I'll just brush paint some of that just to make masking easier. You can do it however you want, but that's the approach I'll be taking. Now for masking, I'm just going to use plain old Tamiya masking tape, and I'll get this guy masked up and get the other paint on, and we'll go from there. Okay, the weapons are painted, and I think they're looking pretty good so far. I did some detail painting back here to fill that in. It's still drying, so if it looks a little glossy and wet, that's because it's a little glossy and wet. But I like the look of that. This one I'm not going to do anything more with it at this time because I'm going to wait until the weathering steps. But we're going to move on with this one. Now, I painted this with Mr. Color Gundam Color MS Phantom Gray, which is the same color I used on the inner frame in a previous installment of this series. For the brush painting, I used again this Phantom Gray from Vallejo. It's, like I said, it's a pretty much dead-on match. So you get the benefits of being able to airbrush with a lacquer paint, which goes on really smooth. But then if you need to do some touch-ups with brush paint, you've got your acrylic to do that, which makes things simpler. But we'll set this guy aside and move on with the rifle. For the beam rifle, I want to go for a metallic, steely, dirty, kind of well-worn and used look. So I want to start off by dry brushing this with a metallic color. Now, I'm going to start off with Citadel's Lead Belcher, which is a great kind of gunmetal color. Now, you can use any color you want. You could use something that's more blue metallic, red metallic, purple metallic. The idea, you'll see, the idea that I'm going for here is a kind of a brushed metallic, scratched up, worn and used weapon look. So the color's kind of irrelevant, it's just my own choice. You pick whatever you want. Now again, I'm going to use, just like I did on the inner frame, I'm going to use this makeup brush and do some dry brushing. Now I've got the Lead Belcher in my palette here, and I'll go ahead and get that on there and wipe that off. Now, unlike the dry brushing I did before, where I was really trying to get it off the brush, for this, I'm okay if it's a little heavier, because I want to end up with more of a steely look than just some edge dry brushing. See how that just almost immediately starts giving it a worn look? And that gray base just really does a nice job of imparting that look to it. Now you can do this with a black base. Again, the colors that I picked are less relevant than the effect that this technique imparts. So if you were doing something that had you wanted more of a red look, for instance, then maybe a dark brown base and then a red metallic over it might look cool. You could do it this way that I'm showing and then put something like a Tamiya clear red over it, or clear blue, and that'll look really cool. I've done gunpla like that, where I painted the frame. I did them in just this way, and then oversprayed them with a clear blue color in one particular instance, and I thought it looked pretty darn good. But I'm going to go ahead and just give this a good dry brush all over, and then show you the next step. The next step will be to apply some Citadel Runefang steel. This is a brighter silverish color, and for this I'm going to use a sponge, a piece of sponge that I'm holding in a clamp like this. And what I want to do here is just impart the look of as if it's been scratched up a bit. You know, the handling of a weapon over time, even the metal is there's gonna be some scrapes and scratches and things like that that'll happen. And so that's what this seeks to emulate. I'm gonna go a little heavier on the handle. Apologies if that's off camera. I'm gonna go a little heavier on the handle here, because obviously that's where it's gonna be held. But you can make this as heavy or as light as you want to get the look that you're going for. Okay, you can see that he's looking a little bit scratched up there. I really love the way that weapons look on a model when you get them at this stage. I just think they look pretty cool. The next thing I want to do is I want to do some shading, and it'll kind of bind everything together, tone it down a little bit, and just really give it a greasy, weapony look. Now, I'm going to use Citadel Nuln Oil for this, the non-gloss Nuln Oil. You can also use, you can use anything you want, but this Vallejo engine petrol spills from their Weathering Effects line, it's virtually the same product as this. The only difference is this is gloss. Now you can get Nuln Oil gloss, but this is gloss. I don't want to have to dull this down to matte it down, so I'm going to go with the just the plain old Nuln Oil for this application. Application is simple enough. I'm just going to get this big brush like this, and I'm going to get some Nuln Oil, and I'm not going to be neat about it, and I'm just going to slather it on there. Make sure you get it in the recesses, the nooks and crannies. You want to make sure you get a good amount in there. But normally I don't let shades pool up, but in this case, I go ahead and do it because it works on weapons. Okay, I've given most of the rifle a coat of Nuln Oil. I left the, I guess I should say the flash suppressor. I left that untreated because I'm going to go back later towards the end of the build and do some soot staining effects, and so I want to leave that a little bit bright so that it shows up better. But you can, if you want, cover that with Nuln Oil. I just took it right up to the edge of the barrel there. But you can see it gives it a really, I think it gives it a fairly cool look. It just looks like a grimy gun that's been used. Which, if that's the effect you're going for, I think is really cool. A final step that I like to take is to try and redefine some of the edges again when using this Prismacolor silver pencil. When you tone everything down with the Nuln Oil, you lose some of the edges, and though you've enhanced the shadows, you've lost a little bit of the shine off of the edges. And so what I like to do is just go in with this Prismacolor pencil and just reestablish some shine along the edges so that those details pop out. It's a little thing. Certainly I would definitely call it, well, all of it's an optional step, but I would definitely call this an optional step. It's just something I like to do that I think helps define the detail. And you can also, if you want to put in some additional scratches and stuff, you can do that. But I just go around and I draw this in, and it just kind of helps define some of those edges. So I'll finish doing that, and we'll move on. All right, I'm going to go back to the bazooka. I just want to do a little bit of additional shading. So I'm going to go back into my Nuln Oil, and using this liner brush, I'm going to get in there and real carefully just start adding some shade into those recessed areas. Now, I want it to flow. I want these to be darkened. I don't want them to be, completely painted black, but I want it to look about like that. And I'll continue doing this, and I'll get these ridges here. You can actually see where I started. This is actually about take 5. So I'm going to get all this filled in and show you how that looks. Okay, you can see the shading has been added in here, and that makes those details just kind of stand out a little bit. Final thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of chipping to this. Now, I don't want this to look as beat up as the rifle. I just want it to show some signs of wear. So I'm going to go back to my sponge, and I'm going to be using the Vallejo Phantom Gray. Now, what that'll do for me is if I accidentally get any on the gray, it's not really going to matter because it's the same color. But the theory here is that the white is painted over the gray. So when it chips, it just chips to that base color. And I just continue doing that to the level I want. And you can go heavy on it. You can do just a few. You could do brush chips on this. I like using these sponges though. So I'm going to continue doing this and show you what that looks like. Okay, I'm going to call the weapons done to this stage. I'll do some weathering on them later in the build as I'm weathering the whole mobile suit. But this is a pretty decent finish here, and I think it shows. Certainly, this doesn't show every way to paint and detail and weather the weapons on a gunpla. There's as many ways as there are people, as I've mentioned in other aspects of this build. But this shows a couple of simple techniques that give you some decent looking weapons that will look good with the rest of the build, and they tell their own story, hopefully. And the techniques are simple enough that with just a very few basic products, you can make this work out easily. So this doesn't have to use the products that I've shown. It doesn't have to be exactly like I've shown, but it's some foundational techniques of dry brushing, sponging, shading, and highlighting to make your weapons look pretty good. Okay, well that's going to wrap up this 5th part of the Building a Gundam series. I hope you found this useful and that it'll give you some ideas for finishing your own weapons on your gunpla or any other model kit you're building. Part 6 is going to cover painting the armor for Bandai's HGUC RX-78-2. I can't believe I said it right that time. This is the 7th take. I finally got it out. Anyway, the next one's going to cover painting the armor, and we'll look at a few techniques there. As always, thank you so much for following my work, for watching this video. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I have my blog. All of that is linked below. A special thanks to everyone who is supporting me on Patreon. Thank you all very much. And if you're not already a supporter, I would greatly appreciate it if you would click on the link in the description below and take a look at the rewards that are offered for patrons there. And I would love for you to support my work. But if you don't do that, at least subscribe to the channel, like this video, and help me out in that way. So until the next part of this series, happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.